The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned crisp and clear over the Hawaiian Islands, with gentle trade winds carrying the scent of plumeria across Pearl Harbor's tranquil waters. Captain Mervyn Bennion stood on the bridge of the USS West Virginia, sipping his morning coffee as he watched the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The battleship row stretched before him like a parade of American naval might. 8 massive vessels anchored in neat formation, their steel hulls gleaming in the early light. Bennion had served in the Navy for over 2 decades, rising through the ranks with distinction. Born in Vernon, Utah, he embodied the steadfast determination of the American heartland. As he gazed across the harbor that morning, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling that had been troubling him for weeks. The intelligence reports coming from Washington spoke of increasing tensions with Japan, but Pearl Harbor felt impossibly distant from any real conflict. The attack that would thrust America into World War II had been months in the planning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, had conceived the operation with meticulous precision. Born in Nagaoka, Japan, Yamamoto understood American industrial capacity better than most of his countrymen. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. This knowledge made him both the architect of Pearl Harbor and, paradoxically, one of its most reluctant advocates. "This operation will give us 6 months," Yamamoto had told his staff officers during the planning sessions in Tokyo. "After that, America's industrial machine will awaken, and we will face a storm the likes of which the world has never seen." At 6 o'clock that morning, First Lieutenant Fusada Ida climbed into his Mitsubishi Zero fighter aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, 6 miles north of Oahu. The 29-year-old pilot from Hokkaido had trained for this moment for over a year. Around him, 183 aircraft prepared for the first wave of what the Japanese called Operation Hawaii. The pilots had studied detailed models of Pearl Harbor until they could navigate its waters blindfolded. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the aerial assault, gave the final briefing to his airmen as the carriers pitched gently in the Pacific swells. "Remember," he told them, "we strike fast, we strike hard, and we disappear like the morning mist. The fate of the Empire rests on the next 2 hours." Back at Pearl Harbor, Seaman First Class James Ward was preparing for church services aboard the USS Oklahoma. The 19-year-old from Oklahoma City had enlisted the previous year, drawn by the promise of adventure and steady pay during the Depression's lingering effects. As he polished his dress uniform, Ward hummed a hymn his mother had taught him, completely unaware that in less than 2 hours, his battleship would be capsized and he would be fighting for his life in the oil-slicked waters of the harbor. The stage was set for one of history's most pivotal moments. 2 nations, each convinced of their righteousness, were about to collide in a spectacular display of violence that would reshape the global order. America, the reluctant giant, was about to be awakened from its isolationist slumber by the sudden flames that would soon engulf the Pacific. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell like thunder from the clear Hawaiian sky. Commander Fuchida's voice crackled over the radio frequencies. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The coded signal that complete surprise had been achieved. The attack had begun with devastating precision. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was among the first to comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding. From his position at the Ford Island Command Center, he watched in horrified fascination as Japanese dive bombers screamed down toward Battleship Row. "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill," he broadcast over the base communication system, his voice cutting through the Sunday morning calm like a blade. The USS Arizona, moored at Berth Fox 7, became the attack's most tragic symbol within minutes of the assault's beginning. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, a distinguished officer from Cleveland, Ohio, stood on the ship's bridge when the first bomb struck. At 8:06 a.m., a 16-inch armor-piercing shell, converted into a bomb by Japanese engineers, penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion that followed lifted the 40,000-ton battleship clear out of the water. Seaman Russell Lott, positioned near the Arizona's stern, felt the world disappear in a wall of flame and thunder. The blast wave threw him 30 feet, through the air, his body tumbling like a rag doll before crashing into the harbor's churning waters. As he surfaced, Gasping and disoriented, he witnessed the Arizona's forward section collapsing into itself, taking with it Admiral Kidd and over 1,000 sailors. According to contemporary accounts documented in the Honolulu Star Bulletin's special December 8th edition, the attack's ferocity exceeded even the most pessimistic military predictions. Captain Bennion aboard the West Virginia found himself commanding a vessel under siege from multiple directions. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbor's surface like deadly birds, their payloads striking with surgical precision. All hands. "General quarters!" Bennion shouted over the ship's intercom as the West Virginia shuddered under repeated impacts. The captain refused to abandon his post, even as shrapnel from near-miss bombs peppered the bridge around him. When a bomb fragment tore through his abdomen, he continued directing damage control efforts until blood loss finally claimed him. Lieutenant John Finn, stationed at the Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station, witnessed the systematic destruction of American air power. Japanese fighters strafed the neatly lined aircraft on the ground, turning millions of dollars of military hardware into twisted metal and acrid smoke. Finn grabbed a machine gun and began firing at the low-flying enemy planes, his tracers arcing across the morning sky in defiant streams of light. The USS Oklahoma, where Seaman Ward had been preparing for church services, became a death trap as Japanese torpedoes tore massive holes in her port side. The battleship began listing heavily to port, her crew scrambling across tilting decks as water rushed into the breached hull. Ward found himself trapped in a compartment that was rapidly filling with seawater and fuel oil. "Help is coming," shouted Petty Officer Stephen Young as he organized rescue efforts for the trapped sailors. Young, a career Navy man from San Francisco, had served on the Oklahoma for 3 years. He knew every inch of the ship's interior, knowledge that would prove invaluable as he led rescue teams through the vessel's dark, flooded passages. The harbor burned with an intensity that could be seen from miles away. Black smoke billowed skyward, creating an artificial twilight that turned the tropical paradise into a vision of industrial hell. The sweet scent of plumeria was replaced by the acrid smell of burning oil and cordite. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft completed their devastating runs and wheeled away toward the north, they left behind a scene of unprecedented destruction. But the attack was far from over. Commander Fuchida was already coordinating the second wave, determined to complete the destruction of America's Pacific Fleet. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at 8:40 a.m., led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. Unlike the first assault, which had achieved complete surprise, this wave met fierce resistance from American defenders who had recovered from their initial shock. The clear morning sky now bristled with anti-aircraft fire, creating deadly curtains of steel that Japanese pilots had to navigate. Seaman Ward, trapped in the capsizing Oklahoma, heard the rhythmic pounding of rescue hammers against the ship's hull. The battleship had rolled completely over, leaving hundreds of men trapped in air pockets within the inverted vessel. Petty Officer Young and his rescue teams worked frantically with cutting torches and pneumatic hammers, racing against time as the air in the trapped compartments grew thin. "Can you hear us?" Young shouted through the steel bulkhead, pressing his ear against the metal to catch any response. The faint tapping that answered him came in the pattern of Morse code. 32 men were alive in Ward's compartment, but their oxygen was running out. Lieutenant Finn continued his solitary battle at Kaneohe Bay, manning his machine gun despite wounds from strafing attacks. Blood streaming down his face from shrapnel cuts, he maintained his position as Japanese fighters made repeated passes at the air station. His defiant fire, though seemingly futile against the overwhelming enemy force, provided inspiration for other sailors who began setting up additional defensive positions. The USS Nevada, partially damaged but still operational, made a desperate attempt to escape the harbor. Captain Francis Scanland ordered the ship to get underway, hoping to reach the open sea where she could maneuver against the attacking aircraft. As the battleship slowly gathered speed, moving past the burning wrecks of her sister ships, she became a magnet for Japanese bombers. Ensign Joseph Tausig, manning one of Nevada's anti-aircraft guns, watched as dive bombers peeled off from their formations to target his ship. The 22-year-old officer from New York had graduated from the Naval Academy just months earlier. Now he found himself in command of a gun crew, their 5-inch weapons spitting defiance at the descending aircraft. "Load! Fire! Load! Fire!" Tausig shouted over the din of battle, his voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. When a bomb explosion severed his left leg, he continued directing his gun crew while bleeding profusely, refusing medical attention until the attack ended. Captain Mervyn Bennian's sacrifice aboard the West Virginia had not been in vain. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillenkoetter, took command of the stricken vessel and organized effective damage control. Sailors worked in teams, shoring up bulkheads and fighting fires while their ships settled slowly into the harbor's mud. Their efforts prevented the West Virginia from capsizing like the Oklahoma. At Wheeler Field, 2nd Lieutenant George Welch and 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor achieved what many thought impossible. They got American fighters airborne. During the attack, racing to Halewa Field in Welch's Buick convertible, the two pilots managed to take off in their P-40 Warhawks just as the second wave arrived. Welch, a native of Wilmington, Delaware, had been partying the previous evening and was still in his tuxedo when the attack began. Now, climbing into the Hawaiian sky, he found himself facing experienced Japanese pilots in superior aircraft. The odds seemed insurmountable, yet Welch pressed his attack with the determination of a man defending his homeland. "I've got one," Welch radioed to Taylor as his guns found their mark on a Japanese dive bomber. The enemy aircraft, its engine smoking, peeled away from its attack run and crashed into the hills beyond Pearl Harbor. It was a small victory and an overwhelming defeat, but it proved that Americans could fight back. The rescue efforts continued throughout the attack. Hospital Corpsman John Carmichael moved through the burning harbor in a small boat, pulling wounded sailors from the oil-slicked water. The surface of the harbor was covered with a thick layer of burning fuel oil that turned the rescue operations into journeys through hell itself. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft departed, leaving behind further destruction, the true scope of the disaster began to emerge. Over 2,000 Americans lay dead, the Pacific Fleet was crippled, and the United States faced its gravest crisis since the Civil War. Yet from the flames and wreckage, heroes had emerged, ordinary men who had performed extraordinary acts of courage when their nation needed them most. In the aftermath of the attack, as rescue operations continued through the night of December 7th, the true character of America began to reveal itself. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had spent years trying to convince an isolationist nation of the growing global threat, now faced a transformed political landscape. The attack on Pearl Harbor had accomplished what no amount of political rhetoric could achieve. It had united the American people in common cause. Dr. Pinkerton, chief medical officer at Tripler Army Hospital, worked through the night treating hundreds of wounded sailors and soldiers. The hospital's corridors overflowed with casualties, their injuries ranging from severe burns to traumatic amputations. Navy nurses like Ensign Ruth Erickson worked beside him, their white uniforms stained with blood and oil as they moved from patient to patient. "We need more plasma," Dr. Pinkerton called out as he worked on a sailor whose body had been riddled with shrapnel. The young man, barely 18 years old, kept asking for his mother between waves of morphine-induced unconsciousness. Across the Pacific, that mother would soon receive a telegram that would change her life forever. The rescue of trapped sailors continued for days after the attack. Petty Officer Young and his teams had successfully cut 32 men free from the Oklahoma's inverted hull, including Seaman Ward, who emerged after 36 hours of entrapment. The hammering sounds from within the ship continued for 2 more weeks, growing fainter each day until finally falling silent. Lieutenant Welch and Lieutenant Taylor, the 2 pilots who had gotten airborne during the attack, found themselves elevated to hero status overnight. Their success in shooting down several Japanese aircraft provided a ray of hope in an otherwise devastating defeat. Welch, still wearing his formal shirt from the previous evening's party, gave interviews to reporters while mechanics worked to repair his bullet-riddled P-40. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, surveyed the devastation from the bridge of a small harbor craft. The man who had built his career on meticulous planning and attention to detail now faced the ruins of his life's work. 18 vessels had been sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships that had been the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. "Sir," his aide reported, "Washington is requesting a complete assessment of our remaining capabilities." Kimmel nodded grimly, knowing that his career was effectively over. The man who had warned of the need for better intelligence and reconnaissance now bore the responsibility for the greatest military disaster in American history. Yet even as the smoke still rose from the harbor, the machinery of American industrial might was beginning to stir. Factory owners across the continent received phone calls from Washington, inquiring about production capacity for everything from aircraft engines to rifle ammunition. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had warned about was beginning to awaken. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who would become known as the father of American shipbuilding, was among the first to respond to the government's call. From his offices in Oakland, California, Kaiser began planning the Liberty ship program that would eventually produce over 2,700 vessels. "We'll build them faster than they can sink them," he promised Navy officials. The attack had also created an unexpected strategic opportunity. The Japanese had concentrated their assault on battleships, considering them the primary threat to their Pacific expansion. However, the American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack, conducting training exercises and transport missions. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the Enterprise Task Force, received word of the attack while returning from Wake Island. The pugnacious officer from Elizabeth, New Jersey, immediately ordered his ships to battle stations and began searching for the Japanese fleet. "When this war is over," Halsey declared to his staff, "the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." As December 8th dawned, President Roosevelt prepared to address a joint session of Congress. The man who had guided America through the Great Depression now faced the challenge of leading the nation into global war. His speech would galvanize not just Congress but the entire American people, transforming a day of infamy into a rallying cry for victory. The Japanese had succeeded in crippling the Pacific Fleet, but they had also awakened a force that would ultimately prove unstoppable. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, America would forge the greatest military machine in human history. President Roosevelt's voice resonated through radio speakers across America on December 8, 1941, as he addressed the joint session of Congress. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The president's words, delivered with measured gravity, marked the end of American isolationism and the beginning of the nation's emergence as a global superpower. Within hours of Roosevelt's declaration of war, young men across the country began lining up at military recruitment offices. In Chicago, the line stretched for 6 blocks outside the Navy recruitment station. James Doolittle, a lieutenant colonel in the Army Air Corps who would later lead the famous raid on Tokyo, watched the scene with satisfaction. "These boys understand what's at stake," he told reporters. "Pearl Harbor has shown us that the oceans no longer protect us." At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, workers arrived early for their shifts on December 8th, many still wearing their Sunday church clothes. The massive shipbuilding facility, which had been operating at reduced capacity due to peacetime budgets, suddenly found itself at the center of the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. Foreman Patrick Murphy, whose father had built ships for the Great War, addressed his workers. "Boys, we've got a job to do. Let's build ships like our lives depend on it, because they do." Admiral Chester Nimitz received orders to assume command of the Pacific Fleet on December 17th. The soft-spoken Texan arrived at Pearl Harbor to find a scene of controlled chaos. Salvage operations continued around the clock, with divers working in the murky waters to recover bodies and assess damage to the sunken vessels. The harbor still reeked of oil and smoke, a constant reminder of the disaster that had befallen the American Navy. "Gentlemen," Nimitz addressed his staff officers during his first meeting, "the Japanese have given us a great opportunity. They've taught us that battleships are obsolete and that aircraft carriers are the future of naval warfare. We're going to build a fleet based on that lesson." The transformation of American industry proceeded with breathtaking speed. Henry Ford, the automotive pioneer, toured the Willow Run plant outside Detroit where his company would soon be producing B-24 Liberator bombers. "We'll build 1 bomber every hour," Ford promised government officials. The assembly line techniques that had revolutionized automobile production were now being applied to instruments of war. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, visited. defense plants across the country, encouraging workers and documenting their efforts. At a Douglas aircraft facility in California, she watched as women workers, many of them wives and daughters of men serving overseas, assembled dive bombers destined for the Pacific. Rosie the Riveter was becoming more than a propaganda poster. She was becoming the backbone of American war production. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, worked 18-hour days coordinating the expansion of American military forces. The Army that had numbered less than 200,000 men in 1940 was growing exponentially. Training camps sprouted across the country like mushrooms after rain, filled with young men learning the arts of war. At Camp Pendleton, in California, Marine recruits learned about their new enemy from instructors who had studied Japanese tactics. Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, a veteran of both World Wars, taught hand-to-hand combat techniques. "The Japanese are tough fighters," he told his trainees, "but they bleed just like anybody else. Your job is to make sure they do plenty of bleeding." The scientific community also mobilized for war. At universities across the nation, physicists and engineers abandoned their academic research to work on military projects. The Manhattan Project, though still in its early stages, began attracting some of the world's brightest minds. J. Robert Oppenheimer, working at the University of California at Berkeley, started preliminary work on what would become the atomic bomb. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring American radio broadcasts from his flagship in Tokyo Bay, began to understand the magnitude of what Japan had unleashed. Intelligence reports spoke of massive increases in American industrial production, far exceeding Japanese capabilities. The 6 months he had predicted for Japanese naval superiority were ticking away rapidly. By the end of December 1941, America had begun its transformation from a reluctant participant in world affairs to the leader of the free world. The flames that had consumed Pearl Harbor had also ignited the greatest industrial and military mobilization in human history. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was angry, and it was preparing to unleash its full fury upon those who had disturbed its slumber. By the spring of 1942, the industrial mobilization that had begun in the ashes of Pearl Harbor was beginning to bear fruit. The first of Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships slid down the ways at shipyards from Maine to California, while Boeing's factories in Seattle worked around the clock producing B-17 Flying Fortresses. The arsenal of democracy was reaching full production capacity. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stood on the deck of the USS Hornet on April 18, 1942, preparing for a mission that would carry the war directly to Japan's homeland. His 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, modified for carrier takeoff, represented America's first opportunity to strike back at the empire that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The psychological impact of bombing Tokyo would far outweigh the physical damage inflicted. "This is for Pearl Harbor," Doolittle told his aircrew as they prepared for takeoff. The raid would be largely symbolic, but symbols mattered in wartime. Just as Pearl Harbor had galvanized American public opinion, the Doolittle raid would demonstrate that Japan itself was vulnerable to American air power. Admiral Nimitz, operating from his rebuilt headquarters at Pearl Harbor, orchestrated the Pacific Fleet's resurgence with methodical precision. The harbor that had been a scene of devastation 6 months earlier now buzzed with activity as new ships arrived from mainland shipyards. The carrier task forces that would become the spearhead of American naval power were taking shape. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American naval aviators proved that they had learned the lessons of Pearl Harbor. Flying from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, pilots like Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon attacked Japanese ships with the same precision that had been used against them. "Scratch one flat top," Dixon radioed as he watched the Japanese carrier, Shoho, sink beneath the Pacific waves. The decisive moment came at Midway on June 4 through 6, 1942. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, faced the same Japanese fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Many of the pilots who had participated in the December 7th assault were now flying from the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet just as it was most vulnerable, with aircraft being refueled and rearmed on the carrier decks. "Attack immediately," McCluskey ordered, beginning the dive that would change the course of the Pacific War. Within minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were burning wrecks. The Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force, became a funeral pyre for many of the pilots who had achieved such devastating success 6 months earlier. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike force, watched helplessly as his carriers were destroyed by the same tactics his pilots had perfected. Lieutenant Dick Best, diving on the carrier Akagi in his SBD Dauntless, could see Japanese sailors abandoning ship as his bomb struck the flight deck. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and ordnance, creating a fireball that consumed the ship and most of her crew. Among the dead was Captain Kichi Hasegawa, who had planned many of the tactical details of the Pearl Harbor attack. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that crippled the Yorktown. But American damage control techniques, perfected in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, kept the carrier afloat long enough for her aircraft to strike back. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the attack that sent Hiryu to the bottom, completing the destruction of Japan's premier carrier. Striking force Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his flagship Yamato, understood that the war had reached its turning point. The 6 months of Japanese naval superiority that he had predicted were ending exactly on schedule. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve," he had reportedly said after Pearl Harbor. At Midway, that giant had fully awakened. The transformation was complete. America had evolved from a nation attacked without warning to the dominant naval power in the Pacific. The industrial capacity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared was now producing ships and aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. The Essex-class carriers rolling off American assembly lines would soon carry the war to Japan's doorstep. Captain Mervyn Bennion, Admiral Isaac Kidd, and the 2,400 Americans who died at Pearl Harbor had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had awakened a nation and set in motion the forces that would ultimately bring Japan to its knees. The sudden flames that had consumed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had ignited a conflagration that would engulf the Pacific and end only with Japan's surrender in Tokyo Bay. The reluctant giant's march to global war had begun with defeat and humiliation. It would end with total victory and America's emergence as the world's dominant superpower. Pearl Harbor had taught the United States that isolation was no longer possible in an interconnected world. The lessons learned in those dark December hours would shape American foreign policy for generations to come. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose not just a rebuilt Pacific fleet, but a new America, confident, powerful, and ready to assume its role as leader of the free world. The attack that was meant to cripple American power had instead transformed the United States into the global superpower that would dominate the remainder of the 20th century.